So now I'm going to tell you about Dr. Tim Berra. Tim is an Academy Professor and Professor Emeritus of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at the Ohio State University and a University Professorial Fellow at Charles Darwin University in Darwin, North Territory, Australia, and a Research Associate at the Museum of Art and Gallery of the Northern Territory. He received his PhD in biology from Tulane University in 1969. He's a three-time recipient of the Fulbright Fellowship to Australia in 69, 79, and 2009. Over the last 50 years, he has spent more than 11 years doing field work in Australia. In 1972, Dr. Berra was visiting professor at the University of Concepcion in Chile, and in 1996, he was visiting professor at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He took early retirement from the Ohio State University in July of '95 to devote full time to research and writing. Dr. Berra is the author of over 85 scientific papers and 9 books. They're about all the subjects that he's studied. This author has written about creationism, fish, Darwin, and now bourbon. This book is entitled Bourbon, and it's got a little icon here, and it's an alligator, and it's got glasses on, so you know it's an intelligent alligator. And it's got a book, and the name of the book is What the Educated Drinker Should Know. Defines what can and cannot be called bourbon, and discusses the history of this uniquely American beverage. It describes how bourbon is made and explains the mash bill, cooking, fermentation, barrel making, distillation, and aging. The book is lavishly illustrated with several of his own color photographs and of distilleries taken along, get this of course, the Kentucky's Bourbon Trail. Dr. Berra is the former editor of the Ohio Journal of Science and was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Columbia Zoo and Aquarium, where he also served on the Conservation and Collection Management Committee. He has also worked on positions supported by the National Geographic Society in Australia, and he's a member of the Board of Governance of the American Society of very difficult words.
Ichthyologist and herpetologist.
There you go. So I'd like to thank him for coming today, and please help me welcome Dr. Tim Berra.
Thank you, Jenny. It's fun to be back. I've tried to count when I was home the other night, about 5 or 6.
I think four
Previous talks, so this is my 5th talk here. And they've been about the life of Darwin, about Darwin's family, about my Australian research, and now for something completely different. We're going to talk about bourbon. So, let's start off with the cliche that we always say, all bourbon is whiskey. But all whiskey is not bourbon. Well, you've got Scotch, and Irish, and Canadian, and rye, and wheat, and bourbon. These are all whiskeys, only one of which is bourbon. How do you spell whiskey? Well, depends where you live, I suppose. The American spelling uses an E, the British spelling does not. So in Scotland and Canada and Japan, they do it the British way. Other places that make whiskey put the E in it. But there are exceptions. For example, Maker's Mark, a good American brand of bourbon, does not put the E in whiskey because their family was Scottish and they've made whiskey forever and they've never used the E. So they continue to not use the E. That's just a little bit of arcane trivia that you'll hear a lot of during this talk. This bottle on the far left there, I guess I can't see where my dot is. The Maker's Mark, that's typical. Dipped in the red wax, it's a trademark, you know exactly what you're getting, Maker's Mark. Look on the right. Those are called over-dipped bottles, or slam dunk bottles. The lady on the assembly line, when the mood strikes her, boom, she plunges it in and takes it. You never know when that's going to happen. There's no counting of these. They're very rare. And I happen to find that one on the right here at Kroger's in Ohio a couple of, I don't know, 6 months ago, and I've been looking for years. It was hidden way down on the bottom shelf behind 3 other rows of Maker's Mark, and I asked the kid at the counter, I said, "What's this? Well, how did you get this?" When? "Oh, it came in last night, and I thought it was a mistake, and it was so ugly, I put it way in the back." "Thank you very much. I'll have that one, please." Spirits have alcohol, but they're all made from different substances. For example, wine and its cousins, brandy and cognac and so forth, are made from fruit. Rum is made from sugar cane. I didn't mention when I showed the whiskey sign, whiskey must be made from grain. Whiskey is made from grain, yeast, and water. That's it. So rum, not a whiskey, made from sugar cane. Tequila is made from agave. Gin can be made from grain, but it also has additives that you can't put in a bourbon. It has botanicals like juniper berry is a common one, but flowers of all sorts. That's gin. Vodka, you can make it out of anything that will ferment, and just you make it out of old sneakers if you want. It can be made from grain, but in Russia and Poland and so forth, there's a tradition of making it from potatoes. The end result is identical. When you're distilling to make vodka, you keep distilling until you get to 190 proof. At that point, you've removed everything. There's nothing in there except ethanol. You're distilling completely to ethanol and a little bit of water. That's it. So people who argue that, my $30 bottle of Grey Goose is so much better than your $10 bottle of Paramount, not really. It's all grain-neutral spirits. And you try side-by-side tastings and you won't know. Now, this flag, and a lot of the pictures in my book, there are 275 of the pictures. They're all mine. I'm the photographer of the book. A lot of them are from Florida, my home on Anna Marie Island, my winter home on 35th Street. Whenever you see a picture of a whiskey bottle with a palm tree nearby, that's in my backyard here. The rest are from Ohio. This is the big flag that you see at Palmasola as you drive across Manatee on the right-hand side or south side of the road. Big thing. Took me weeks and weeks to get that perfect photo with the blue sky and the unfurling and flapping just a little bit. This is the most important slide in the book, because you must commit this slide to memory if you're going to say anything about bourbon. Bourbon must be made in the United States by act of Congress. 1964, law was passed. Has to be made in America. Just like Scotch has to be made in Scotland. You can't make Scotch in America. Well, you can't make bourbon anywhere except in America. The standard of identity requires that the grain bill, or the mash bill, or the recipe, whatever you want to call it, must be a minimum of 51% corn. Has to be a majority corn recipe. It has to be aged in new, charred oak containers. You cannot use these barrels over again. So once the bourbon is dumped out of the barrel and put in the bottle, what do you do with that barrel? You sell it to Scotland, where they age the Scotch in bourbon barrels. And I tell my Scotch drinking friends that's why it's so good. It's got a little bourbon in it. Because each barrel, these 53-gallon barrels, the wood will absorb about 2 gallons of the bourbon that goes with it. So when the Scotch is moving in and out of the wood, it's bringing that bourbon with it, and that is actually getting into the Scotch. You cannot add anything to bourbon. No coloring, no flavoring. So you can for Scotch and some other whiskeys, but you cannot for bourbon. Nothing can be added to bourbon except water. If you add something, you can't call it bourbon. it has to be distilled to no more than 160 proof. Remember I said vodka goes up to 190 proof. Well, that difference, those congeners that do not come out in the bourbon distillation, that's giving some flavor that you don't get in grain neutral spirits or vodka. When you put it in the barrel, it has to be in there at no more than 125 proof. So if it's coming off the still at 160 proof, you have to dilute it down with water to 125 proof to put it in the barrel. And then when you put it in a bottle, you have to bottle it at no less than 80 proof. So if you see something that says 70 proof, it's not bourbon. It can't legally be called bourbon. Well, who's going to enforce this? These guys, the Tax and Trade Bureau. This used to be part of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And then when that was split off into the new Homeland Security business after 9/11, this bureau is in charge of enforcing the standards of identity for bourbon and scotch and all the other whiskeys. You can make bourbon anywhere in America. That's a very common misconception that a lot of people have. Oh, this wasn't made in Kentucky, therefore it's not bourbon. Not true. You make it anywhere in America. Never mind the fact that 95% of all bourbon is made in Kentucky. But Wyoming bourbon is perfectly good. Texas bourbon can be fine. Virginia bourbon, New York bourbon. I tried making a list, and it looks like every state has some little distiller somewhere making bourbon. Well, why did we end up making whiskey? This is an interesting historical bit. Now, there's a lot more in my book that I'm going to cover here. I can't do it all in this time period. So I'll just mention a couple of little historical things. During the Revolutionary War, our access to rum was cut off because this was a British thing. And we weren't buying, we were at war. However, the areas are in Maryland and Pennsylvania and so forth were growing rye, and this was being distilled into rye whiskey. At the formation of our country in 1776, the Commonwealth of Virginia, which actually had this big appendage on it that we now know of as Kentucky, they wanted people to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they said, if you'll come down here to Kentucky, plant corn and build a cabin, we'll give you 400 acres in your name. That got settlement going. The people who were doing that were from, Maryland and Pennsylvania, and immigrants who had distillation in their culture, like Germans and Scottish and Irish and so on. So they brought their stills with them. They were able to grow this incredible amount of corn because it was such a rich, fertile area. Well, what do you do with all this corn? How do you get it back to where somebody will buy it? It's heavy, hard to transport. You convert it into whiskey, you might take 23 bushels of corn and you end up with 50 gallons of whiskey. That can easily be put on the mule and moved around, and it's more valuable and it doesn't rot. Bourbon or whiskey became the new currency of this area. Why is it called bourbon? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. The most favored, it's really hard to nail this down. The name bourbon, of course, is from the French royal family. And Louisville was named after Louis XVI, a Bourbon part of the dynasty. And when the whiskey was made and put in barrels, the barrels were labeled with where they came from. And this part of Kentucky was simply called Bourbon County. It was the county of Virginia, Bourbon County. What was in it was whiskey. So they stamped that on the barrel head. So this goes down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, shaken up, and is aging while it's doing it. Gets to New Orleans and people like it. They want to order more. What do they order? They use the barrel head. They say, we want some of this bourbon whiskey. And that's the prevailing thought among historians. But there are 2 or 3 other explanations that are in my book, and it's really hard to know. Here, here's what it looked like in the early days of the flatboats going down the river. And this kinetic transport of shaking it around inside the barrels that had been burned originally with a little straw fire in them to clean them out, remove splinters, help bend the stays and so forth. This is really what turned the trick of getting this clear distillate into this beautifully colored and flavored whiskey. What's the age requirement to be called bourbon? Another source of a lot of misconception. There isn't any age requirement. You can call it bourbon if it's 5 minutes in a new charred oak barrel. But where the confusion is the phrase straight bourbon. You look at a bourbon bottle, read the label. If it says straight bourbon, that's a word you want to see on your bourbon barrel, on your bottle. Straight bourbon, because that does have an age requirement. To be called straight bourbon, it must be aged a minimum of 2 years, or 3 years. If it's aged 4 years, it's a straight bourbon, but you don't have to put a date on it. If it's aged less than 4 years, you have to put the number of years. Age 2 years, age 36 months, straight bourbon. If it doesn't say an age statement, it's a minimum of 4 years. And that applies to rye whiskey and wheat whiskey as well. So straight is the operative word. Here are some examples of older bourbons. This Barter House there, these are all bottles from my collection of 20 years. That's a long time to keep in a barrel. The I.W. Harper, 15 years. Knob Creek, that's a lovely bourbon from Jim Beam. Note at the bottom there in red, it says age 9 years. You go trying to find that in a store today. You can't. They've stopped putting the age date on it because they can't make it fast enough. We're in this big renaissance time of bourbon. Many places that when I started writing this book put the age on don't do it anymore. They just can't make it fast enough. It flies off the shelf. You can't just ring up the distillery and say, quick, make me some 12-year-old bourbon. It's going to take 12 years from that phone call. Yeah, good. So they're not putting age statements, because the labeling laws are such that you must put the age of the youngest whiskey on the label if you're blending. And what Knob Creek now does is it tastes the same. I mean, I can't tell a difference in ones that say 9 years and ones that don't, because they blend maybe some 11-year-old and some 8 years and some 4 years. The master distiller is doing this, getting that flavor profile. But if they wanted to put an age date, they'd have to put the youngest whiskey date. And so they don't want that. They don't do it. And that's happening all over the bourbon industry. You gotta read the labels carefully. Interesting stuff on labels when you start getting discriminating here. Ancient age. It's not a typo. I mean, there is an ancient age, but there's an ancient age, which is a little older. And it's very nice. This is a very inexpensive whiskey. You'll find them on the bottom shelf. You often hear the term when you're reading the whiskey magazines, this is a bottom shelf whiskey, meaning it's inexpensive. High price stuff is up here at your eye level. But an ancient age is quite nice. But see that 10? People think, 10-year-old whiskey for that price? Holy cow, what a great buy. And it isn't years. 10 stars. That's just decoration. You don't mean anything. Now, here's the important part. Now, you probably can't read it here, but distilled, aged, and bottled by Ancient Age Distilling Company. They make their own whiskey. They distill it, they age it, they bottle it. Whereas many other whiskeys, like Corner Creek, a very nice whiskey, if you read that, it says distilled, aged, and bottled in Kentucky. By whom? They don't tell you. They source their whiskey. They get it from somewhere. But they got it from somewhere in Kentucky, which is usually a good thing, but they don't tell you who. And what they say underneath that, bottled by Corner Creek Distilling. So they put the label on the bottle, but they bought the whiskey from somewhere else in probably from Heaven Hill, which is a very good distillery, and they make whiskey for other brands. They don't tell you. Mash bill, very important. This is the recipe. Most bourbons are somewhere in the vicinity of 70% corn. And a typical secondary grain would be maybe 25% rye. It's very typical. And then 5% barley. So mostly 3 grains, secondary grains, usually rye. You have to have a little bit of barley because barley has some enzymes when you malt it. When you germinate it, stop the germination, there are enzymes in that barley which convert the starch molecules of the grain into simple sugars, which can then be digested by the yeast to produce the alcohol. So barley is always involved here. Some distilleries prefer a higher amount of rye than 10, 11, 15%, 18, 20, 25%. Bullet, a nice bourbon, listed there, 28% rye. That's known as a high rye bourbon. So these are not always listed on the label. This is sort of the thing you learn as you're evolving in your whiskey drinking. Now, not all bourbons use rye as a secondary grain. Quite a few distilleries use wheat instead. So it'll be corn as the dominant grain, wheat as the secondary grain, and a little bit of barley. Those are called wheated bourbons. A wheated bourbon is different tasting than a rye bourbon, slightly, if you educate your palate. Rye bourbons tend to be spicier, peppery. Wheated bourbons tend to be softer, sweeter. And they're, Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon, for example. You may not know that, but you're getting wheat instead of rye in there. Now, do not confuse a wheated bourbon with wheat whiskey, or a rye bourbon with rye whiskey. If it's a rye whiskey, it's got to be a minimum of 51% rye. If it's a wheat whiskey, it's got to be a minimum of 51% wheat. So those are different whiskeys, but bourbon may have rye or wheat in it. And now they're starting to make it with 4 grains, which is interesting. If you're a single malt Scotch drinker, you're drinking barley that's been fermented. It's 100% barley. That's what the single malt refers to. If you like a blended Scotch, like Johnny Walker, very nice Scotch, it's a blend of all kinds of Scotch whiskeys, some of which are made more with corn than with barley. So they blend them to get the flavor they want. So there's a lot going on here in whiskey that you got to think about. Water is a very important part of whiskey making. Kentucky is very lucky in being underlain by this huge limestone aquifer. So all the water in these 90,000 streams of Kentucky percolates through this limestone, which filters out the iron. It adds calcium carbonate and magnesium and calcium that the yeast like. This is superb water for making bourbon, and that's one of the reasons that Kentucky has such a large bourbon production. On the other hand, there's no reason you can't make bourbon simply using the local county's water supply out of the pipes, as long as it's, you do the chemical test and make sure it doesn't have iron and other things, it works fine too. Well, the cooking process, when you get the grain, the corn, the rye, the barley, you grind it up into a very fine meal and you cook it like cream of wheat or oatmeal or something like that. That's what it looks like a gruel, very finely divided. And that's the beginning of this. To this cooking mass, you add part of the used distillate from the previous batch you've made. That's called the setback. It's the used stillage. You put that back in the cooker. That way, you're helping control the pH. This is called a sour mash process. You're getting the pH that was in the previous batch. You're getting the part of the yeast that was in the previous batch. you're ensuring consistency from batch to batch to batch to batch. You know, it's like when you make sourdough bread, you take a starter and keep going on. Same thing in bourbon. 99% of bourbons are sour mash. Very few are sweet mash, and these are usually small productions that, you know, don't have nearly the output of the big fellows. Fermentation is the chemical breakdown of a substance by yeast. And the byproducts of this are ethanol, carbon dioxide, and it's an exothermic reaction. It gives off heat. Now here's a nice cypress wood vat where fermentation is taking place. The stuff has all been cooked, the setback has been added, it's fermenting. Those are the bubbles on the surface. This goes on 3 or 4 days, and the result is called distiller's beer. And this is the same way you make beer. If you stop there, you're making beer. Keep going, you can make whiskey. The alcohol content here can get 8, 9, 10%. When it gets up real high, it kills off the yeast and the process stops. So this is one of the first steps. Then we move on to distillation. Distillation is how you separate mixtures of liquids because they have different boiling points. You know, alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Alcohol boils at like 78 degrees Celsius. So the alcohol comes off first, and that's what you capture. There are 2 kinds of stills. There are these really tall column stills. Some of these things can be 60, 70 feet tall. Smaller ones can be 6 feet tall. They have these little windows in them that are divided at each window level by perforated plates. You put the distillate at the top, you put steam at the bottom, it percolates down through the plates that have holes in them, and the alcohol comes off. That is a column still, also called a continuous still, because you keep it going and going and going. The other type of still is a pot still. Now, pot stills were how it all got started. European whiskey, Scotch, Irish, so they're all made in pot stills, and you get kind of a different production. You can only do it once because then you have to clean it out and start over, whereas continuous still, you keep it going and going and going. So most bourbon is made through the continuous distillation method. However, Woodford Reserve makes it in pot stills. That's one of their claims to fame. The most beautiful bottle in all of bourbondom, I think, is a Willet, and it's obviously shaped like a pot still. Beautiful bottle. And what's inside is pretty decent. Now, bourbon is double distilled. The first distillation is in this big, tall column still. What's pictured here is a demonstration still in Beam, at the Beam distillery, so I can show both of these together. So you do the column still first. The product is clear alcohol water mixture you get out. It's about 125 proof, and it's called low wine. You collect that. You then put it in the pot still for a second distillation. That distillate comes out at about 135 proof. It's called high wine. That's what you put in the barrel to start aging. So it's distilled twice. It's an improvement. It's taking out more impurities than the first distillation and so forth. The barrel it goes into must be new. It must be charred on the inside, and it must be made of oak. And here's an example. There are 4 levels of char. Most distilleries use the 3rd level and the 4th level of char, the deepest chars. And that breaks apart the surface. The charring helps carbonize that internal layer, but even deeper, it toasts the wood sugars that are deeper in the wood. And that's where the vanillins and these various flavors of the wood can be put into the whiskey. Because alcohol is a solvent, it's moving in and out of this wood, it's dissolving those things that you've toasted up. There's a firing of the barrels now in the modern cooperage, they fire them instead of putting, you know, a bundle of hay and letting that on fire. They have jets of flame and so forth. The hooks that hold the barrel together with the rivets, look carefully at the bottom there, the rivets. If they have KY and MO on there, that refers to Kentucky and Missouri Cooperage of International Stave Company. That's where the barrel was made. And they make most of the barrels for all the big ones, except the distillery is owned by Brown Forman, like Jack Daniels, the biggest seller of them all. Woodford, early times. They're owned by Brown Forman, and those barrels have B on the rivets. So the next time you have a chance to look at old bourbon barrels, and you might see a planter on sale at Home Depot, check out the rivets. And this is what you'll get out of a book like this, little tiny.
Is there a particular oak that's used?
Well, 100% here it would be American white oak, Corpus alba, which it's not specified. You could use any. If you use red oak, you get nothing because it would leak out like a sieve. And that's all explained in the book. Now, these barrels full of whiskey, they're 53 gallons. They're stored for maturation in a rick house, R-I-K. Rick house is another word for a warehouse. It's called a rick because the barrels are put 3 high in this framework, which is the rick. All the distilleries use these multi-story houses, except for Roses. They're the odd man out. They use a single-story rick house. What they're trying to do is control the temperature variation. In a, say, a 9-story rick house, the difference between the bottom level and the top level can be as much as 35 degrees in the summer. You know, heat rises. In the single story, it's only going to be about 8 degrees. So Four Roses is saying we're keeping real good control over the heat here, and that way all of our barrels will be aged pretty much the same regardless of where they are. Whereas Jim Beam or any of the other guys, the barrels in the top are aging much faster than the barrels on the bottom. And the master distiller, of course, is aware of all this, and he's doing this deliberately to blend different concoctions to make the flavor he wants. Inside the rick house is a wonderful place. You smell this bourbon. It is just fantastic. You breathe it in. What you're breathing in is called the angel share. The angels have to get their due here. They're getting paid in bourbon. And I just love it. You walk in these rick houses, you know where you are. Here's a cross section of a barrel stave, and you can see the black on the inside of the barrel is the carbon part. Then that little thin red line, that's where the wood sugars have all been affected by both the toasting and the charring. That's where the magic happens. And then there's even further seepage into the wood beyond that. Here's a system of barrels at Woodford Reserve. They use 3 pot stills as their symbol. The higher up on the rick, the faster it's aging. Here's a 9-story Jim Beam rick house. The diagram on the left is a cross section of that. What the master distiller will do is take barrels, they're stored 3 high in each level, so there's actually 9 groupings of 3 high barrels. He'll take some from say, the highest on the west side, go all the way down to the lowest on the east side, and then the opposite on the other side. And each one of these barrels is going to have unique characters. He's looking for barrels that will give him the flavor profile when he blends them together of exactly what he wants. The couple flowers there in pink, the master distiller will know and recognize that in some places of the rick house, something special is happening. It may be because of the way the sun strikes that metal panel on the outside of the rick house, or for some reason, those at this corner are really good. those are going to be singled out and put in either a small batch bourbon or a single barrel bourbon, where what's in the bottle came from one big barrel of bourbon, but no other bourbons, no other barrels were included. Or he'll charge you more for that, and it'll say single barrel bourbon or small batch bourbon. Here's an example of how the angels take their share. In the first year of aging, about 10% is lost. The 4 years down the road, you're losing 3 or 4% every year. So that's what you've got left. 78% of that 53 gallons are still there. 9 years, that's what Knob Creek used to be. 9 years, you have lost 39% of what you started with. Now, this bourbon on the left there, Pappy Van Winkle's, this is what everybody hears about as an unattainable goal. You'll never find one of these, you'll never get it, and if you do find it, you can't afford it. These things, very rare. The demand is so high, they never hit the shelf. The liquor store owner will ring up the guy who buys, $50,000 a year from him and says, hey, I've got a bottle of Pappy's. What will you pay? That sort of thing. And then the guy who buys it puts it on eBay for $3,000. But a 23-year-old bourbon, you're probably getting 14 gallons out of that 53-gallon starting point. That's why it's so rare, so expensive. One of the things that struck me, and one of the reasons that I ended up writing this book, is that the more I started tasting different bourbons and getting interested in this, the more I enjoyed it and realized, heck, each one of these is different. How is that? They're all made pretty much the same way with the same stuff. Why do they all taste different? Well, there's these little variations. And here's a list. The mash bill you start with. The yeast strain. These are jealously guarded by the distillers. The length and temperature of fermentation. The barrel characteristics and how the barrel is prepared. Some places want to even grow their own wood to make sure they keep control. The entry proof into the barrel. You can't put it in more than 125 proof, but you can put it in at less. And some distillers like to do that. The position in the rickhouse is very, very important. The time in the rickhouse, the age. Age is an ingredient here. Time is an ingredient. And one thing I should point out, once you take the bourbon out of the barrel, aging stops. This is not like wine. If you buy a 10-year-old bourbon and keep it for 10 years unopened, you do not have a 20-year-old bourbon. You've got a 10-year-old bourbon. It's the interaction with the wood that is the aging. So here's a summary of the whole process. So you get the grains and you mill them, make a real fine powdery milling actually, put that in the cooker at various temperatures, and you put the different grains in at different times and so forth. It gets very technical and it varies with each distiller. To that cooking mess, you add the setback. That's part of the stillage of the previous batch. Put that in there, drop it into the fermentation tank with the yeast. Fermentation goes on. After 3 or 4 days, you take that and introduce it to near the top of the still where it dribbles down those copper plates. Copper is the important material to use in all distillation. It removes the various sulfur products, and the heat transfer is excellent. So it trickles down those copper plates while you're introducing steam at the bottom. That volatilizes the ethanol that's been made in fermentation. You put that into a condenser. You take that ethanol gas, condense it to a liquid. Then you do the second distillation in a pot still. Same procedure. You then condense that second distillate. That's your high wine. You then put that in the barrel and you wait. Why do we use the term proof when we talk about whiskeys? Wild Turkey 101 is 101 proof. What's that mean? Well, the proof is double the alcohol by volume. So the alcohol by volume of this is 50.5%. But why do we use the word proof? Well, it goes back to the old British sailors in the Royal Navy. They would get a rum ration. When the quartermaster poured out their little cup of rum, they wanted to be sure it wasn't diluted, that he didn't take a few sips for himself and fill the rest with water. So he'd take some gunpowder, wet it down with this rum, and put a match to it. It poof, and burn and hiss and spit. If it did, that was proof it was good stuff. That's what's going on there. So, you know, I've read about this in many other places. I said, well, I gotta try this. You know, I've never heard of anybody. That's the scientist in me coming out. So I went to the local gun dealer place I've never been in my life, and had to sign my life away to buy a pound of gunpowder, black powder. And you can't buy it in that much. You gotta buy a jug of this stuff. And well, now what? You know. So I took it to my lab and weighed out a gram. A pound is 454 grams. So I weighed out a gram of this, not knowing what's going to happen. And then I went to the dollar store and bought a big steel serving spoon, put that gram in the serving spoon, got my neighbor to come over and use a charcoal lighter, the thing you pull the trigger, click, click, click. So he's down there with that, and I have my camera set on motor drive and waiting to what the heck is going to happen. And poof, it did that, and I fired off like 16 photos on motor drive, and a couple of them are really terrific like that. So don't try this at home. I'm really glad I did. It didn't use more than a gram.
What you do with the rest of the gunpowder?
It's still in my basement. I don't know what to do with it. I don't want to get arrested with it. A lot of the pictures in my book you're going to see are, you know, you see the palm tree and the pine. This is here on Anna Maria. All my whiskey photographs are either here or in Ohio. That's what I do when I'm here. I drive to Hurricane Hanks and to Longboat Liquor Store and to ABC and to Norman's and to Total Wine. I have my routine throughout, and I buy oddball bourbons that I haven't seen before or that I've read about or that I want to try. That's why I have 175 bourbons. But anyway, people are going to say, they ask me all the time, is Jack Daniel's a bourbon? Bar fights start over this question. Well, in my book, I unequivocally answer this. Yes and no. There's no reason you can't call Jack a bourbon. It's made with the same ingredients in the same way, blah, blah, blah. But the owner of Jack is Brown Forman. They choose not to call it a bourbon. They've created a marketing niche called Tennessee whiskey. They want it to be separate. They don't want it to be bourbon. They want it to be different, because there are hundreds of bourbons, many fewer Tennessee whiskey. So they call themselves Tennessee whiskey, but they meet all the requirements of bourbon. Now there is one minor difference. Tennessee whiskeys undergo what's called a Lincoln County process. Well, most Tennessee whiskeys, they don't have to, they all don't. And that's where the distillate is trickled through a huge charcoal filter made out of sugar maple charcoal. And it may take days for this to trickle down the 10 feet of it, so then it's bottled. That acts like a big aquarium filter and takes out some rougher tasting molecules, and that's why a lot of people like Jack, because it tends to be smooth and sweet. And that gives it a slightly different taste than some other bourbons. And so the people who don't want to call it a bourbon will say, well, it's made by the Lincoln County process, so it's different. Well, that's a distinction without a difference. There's some bourbons that do that too, they don't even talk about it. So it really is a bourbon, but call it whatever. You gotta read the labels. I keep saying that over and over. A lot of people like Seagram 7 for some reason. You know, they'll order a 7 and 7. Well, read the label. What are you getting with Seagram 7? If you look at the fine print, 75% grain neutral spirits. This is 75% vodka. It's just ethanol, to which 25% real whiskey has been added. That's what Seagram 7 is. I mean, I'm not saying that, well, I guess I am saying that disparagingly. It doesn't have to be. If you like it, you like it. You know? But it's certainly not a bourbon, and it's not even, you know, it's barely a whiskey if you want to get that technical about it. 10 high. That used to be a decent name. Now it's a real lower shelf bourbon. Well, not truly a bourbon. Note that they say on the bottle, a blend. They have to say blend. Blend of what? Well, when you look at the neck strap on there, 51% straight whiskey, aged 36 months. Ah, so good, so far so good. 49% grain neutral spirits. So that's half vodka. It may be twice as good as Seagram 7, but it's still only half whiskey. Read the label. People like to ask, what's your favorite bourbon? I can't give a one-word answer to that. I like a lot of them. How much do you want to spend? You know, the inexpensive, really good bourbons I picked out 3 there: Buffalo Trace, Elijah Craig, and Evan Williams Single Barrel. See the big red 12 on there? You won't find that anymore. That was one of the biggest bargains in all of Bourbonton. 12-year-old, really good bourbon, really inexpensive. They can't make it fast enough. So it's Elijah Craig's small batch, but there's no longer an age statement. But all those are really good. They're probably under $27, somewhere in that vicinity. Nothing wrong with them. You want to spend $60 or more? Some of the ones on the bottom. 2 there that I go to most at home when I just want to sip. You know, depends on the mood. Or is it a cold night and I want to read a book, or am I celebrating something? With Blanton's, which is a single barrel bourbon, or Woodford Reserve Double Oak. It'll taste very different than Woodford Reserve. Double Oak, put in a second barrel with an additional aging, and it totally changes. Now, those other things on the right, those are not bourbons, they're whiskeys, and they're delicious. High West Campfire is a menage a trois of bourbon, rye, and scotch. And it's called Campfire because of the smokiness the scotch adds to it. It's really good. Stranahan's is a sour mash American, a sweet mash American whiskey. Yippee-ki-yay, that's a rye. Now, there's a story behind the name, which I won't talk about in Fly Company, but if you know the movie, what the heck? Bruce Willis, where he's the Die Hard. If you Google Yippee-ki-yay and Die Hard, you'll see why it's called Yippee-ki-yay. Yippee-ki-yay, you. And then, Ritnar is a rye that's really nice and inexpensive. Here are all the major American distilleries. They all make their own stuff. They all have multiple expressions, as we call the various different types of their whiskey. This is interesting. It's in the book. You'll have to read to see what, but who owns what? You know, much of our American spirit is owned by foreign investors. The Japanese, for example, own Jim Beam and everything Beam makes. They own Maker's Mark. That's all Japanese. Four Roses is Japanese. Wild Turkey is Italy. Bullet is United Kingdom. And a bunch of others. Now, all the things made by Sazerac, like Buffalo Trace and Pappy's and Weller's and all these things, those are American made. Heaven Hill, which makes Elijah Craig and Old Fitzgerald and Larceny and so forth, those are American made. Brown Foreman is an American company. That's Old Foster and Woodford Reserve, Jack Daniels. It's real interesting.
So they are made here?
Oh, they have to be made in America. The corporate ownership.
The profits.
Yeah. Now, I'm urging you to all take a vacation along the Bourbon Trail. Even if you don't like bourbon, you'll learn so much, and it's so beautiful and enjoyable. In the spring, you drive down, you make your camp at Bardstown, and you go, 30 miles in north, south, east, or west. You'll hit 5 or 6 distilleries in each direction. Take the tour, take some drinks. Let me get through this, and then we'll Buffalo Trace. Many of these distilleries are national heritage sites because they've been operating so long, back in the 1700s and so forth, and they're beautiful campuses. They're like universities, some of them. Woodford Reserve, stone rickhouses, that's a unique thing. Maker's Mark, very pretty place. There's a ceiling that runs like 17 feet in one of the rickhouses of Chihuly glass. These things are worth seeing, Heaven Hill, enormous rickhouses everywhere you look. Four Roses has 2 separate campuses, depending on what they're going on. The rickhouses are, 20 miles away from the distillery. Others, like Wild Turkey, are very industrial looking, because they're made to do a manufactured product. Barton's, which makes 1792. 1792, by the way, is when Kentucky was admitted to the Union, so you can get a bourbon in 1792. Here's a map in the book of the trail, and many of these distilleries are pictured on there and telling you how to get there, but you can go to the website that I've listed and print off a big copy of this and so forth. Here's my library. This picture is a couple years old. I now have bottles all over the floor. My wife won't take the vacuum cleaner in there anymore. She just keeps that door closed, and when she wants me, she comes and knocks on the door. She knows I'm in there doing something. Mark Twain said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whiskey is barely enough." I brought with me to Anna Maria when I got here in December. I had 30 some odd copies of my book. I have 8 left. You can get them on Amazon. I mean, people at the gym just say, "Hey, did that book of yours ever come out?" And yeah, I got some. They sold them out of my trunk, which I don't. Nobody buys my Darwin books out of my trunk. But you can get it on Amazon. Go to Amazon, order it, and they'll ship it to you. But I've got 8 I'm happy to sell for $25. The list price is $26.95. I don't know if it's I'll sign it for you. And that's what I've got to say. If you've got any questions,
What is an orphan barrel?
Oh, okay, good question. Orphan barrel is, well, there's an awful lot of hype in the advertising of bourbon. A lot of really exaggerated rhetoric goes on labels, but it has to be honest. It can't say anything that isn't true. But the label orphan barrel refers to, and this is the story behind it, that a group of barrels is found in a rickhouse that hasn't been looked at for years and years and years. And some of these, they'll say, go back to 20 years or more. It's been in there. Nobody bothered to check on it. It's there. So all of a sudden, we found them, and we're going to bottle them as a separate production that we're labeling an orphan barrel. And some of these come from rickhouses that are no longer run by distilleries that have gone extinct and that made really great whiskey years ago, and all of a sudden these barrels turn up and people think of them as a treasure. Well, sometimes,
What was the distillery that just, well, I say within the 5 years or so, had a major fire?
Oh, yeah, that was a beam, I think, yeah. And what they lost was trivial compared to what they had. I mean, each rickhouse holds about 19,000 barrels, which contains about 1 million gallons. And they may have Well, Jim Beam makes about 1,900 barrels a day. I mean, they're a big company. Whereas little places like Willett, they're lucky to do, 100 barrels a month, which is why their whiskey's hard to find.
You suggested when you started out that they can't make bourbon fast enough. I thought hard liquor was down, but wine drinking was the thing.
Well, wine drinking is certainly doing well too, but there is this renaissance. Since I started writing this book, I can't keep up with the new craft distilleries that are turning out products. There's a big rush on this, and it's happening internationally too. Japanese love our bourbon, and that's why they bought Jim Beam, man in the back in the pink.
I was surprised when I went through the Dickel distillery.
Oh yeah, Tennessee.
You know, you go through it and I'm thinking it's like wine tasting. You get to the end and it's a dry county. And
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't, are they all like that? Are they
No,
all
they're
like
not
that?
all, but that's one of the anachronisms of America. After Prohibition, when Prohibition was repealed, a local option was created. You don't have to sell whiskey, you can go dry, which is why, 27 counties of Kentucky are still dry to this day. Now, George Dickel is the second largest selling Tennessee whiskey after Jack Daniels. But for every bottle of George Dickel that's sold, 100 bottles of Jack Daniels are sold. And Dickel is number 2.
Yeah.
So that shows you how powerful Jack is.
I was at the Barclay plantation on the James River a few years ago, and they said that they were the place where bourbon was invented. Is that true or not?
I would basically say no to any stories like that. They're legendary about, bourbon was invented by this Baptist minister, Elijah Craig. I mean, it's all nonsense. There's no historical verification of any of these things. Lots of legends in the bourbon industry. And you'll find them as you read other bourbon books, but serious historians debunk all of these things. Yes?
Hi, can you give an example of wheat is sweeter and maker's more? What's an example of a rye-based bourbon?
Almost anyone you would name. Jim Beam is rye. Most bourbons are rye. It's easier to tell you some of the wheated bourbons. Weller's is a wheated bourbon. Larceny is a wheated bourbon. The Pappy Van Winkle business. Old Fitzgerald, those are wheated. But almost everything else, you think of Four Roses is rye. Jim Beam is rye. And a lot of these things are interrelated. This is what I loved about doing this book. There's a bourbon called I've got so much in my head I can't. Basil Hayden. Well, Basil Hayden is the name of a historical figure. He's part of the Beam family. Old Granddad is what his relatives called him. So there's also a bourbon called Old Granddad, and Old Granddad is Basil Hayden. Now, all these things are interdigitated, which is one of the things I love about doing a book, like finding these little arcane, trivial facts. In case Alec Trebek ever asks you this, you will have it down. Yeah.
In Scotland, a number of the distilleries will store competitors' barrels, and they did that because of a couple of fires where the whole
Sure.
thing was. Does that happen in Kentucky too?
Well, there are similar things. I have to do a little digression. The Beam family is everywhere. There are Beam distillers at almost every other distillery besides Beam. They're the cousins and the nephews, and they all went into distilling. And there are Beams that run Heaven Hill. There are Beams that run Yellowstone. There are Beams that run this, that, and the next thing. Well, Heaven Hill had a humongous fire. It's in my book. I forget the date, but they lost everything. Well, the other distillers, particularly Beam and Woodford Reserve, says, we don't wanna see you out of business. You can use our equipment and make your bourbon in our stills, and we'll hold it for you until you can build a new one and get back up. They did that. I mean, it is a community of family almost. And I've seen that as I travel around and meet master distillers from everywhere. They don't badmouth one another and say theirs is better. They recognize they're all in the same game and they're all related.
What's your opinion in regards to the Renaissance? What, in your opinion, caused this to happen?
Well, there's probably more than one explanation. Having discretionary income is a good thing, so that you can spend more than if you were really pinching pennies. You don't need a $60 bourbon, you can get a $20 bourbon. And the new push to make it in different places in small distilleries that are called craft distilleries. One person may decide, I'm gonna make bourbon, and they invest some money and get the equipment, and they turn out, 20 barrels or something, and then it grows and grows. That's another thing that happens, is that the first thing you distill, you get your grain neutral spirits. But if you wanna make a decent bourbon, you gotta have it aged. But if you've just invested $4 million in these stills and space and everything else, you're not gonna have anything to sell straight away. So what do? You take this grain neutral spirit and you put little satchels of juniper berry and 20 different flowers from Ohio in there. You got gin straight away. You can put that on your shelf a couple of weeks after making it. And so you have something to sell while your other stuff is aging. Or you immediately put a label on it, call it vodka. You don't have to put anything in it. It's grain neutral spirits. You put a label on it. You're drinking the same alcohol I used to pickle my fish. And in fact, I've done that when I'm out in the field. If I don't have any more alcohol, or if I want to take a DNA sample, you have to use alcohol instead of formalin that I usually use. Pickling fluid is formalin most of the time, 10% formalin. Drop the fish in there. But if I want a DNA sample, you can't use the formalin, so I have to use ethanol, and the closest ethanol would be in my vodka bottle. So there you go. Yes, sir.
You mentioned dry counties. Back during Prohibition, what happened to these distilleries?
Well, I go into a fair detail in the book about this, but I don't have time in this talk, so let me give you the rundown. It was a disaster. Almost everybody went broke and out of business. That's why we're still finding some of these orphan barrels, that these distilleries, these rick houses, have been shuttered ever since. Only 6 distilleries were allowed to function during Prohibition, and it's not that they couldn't distill, they were allowed to keep their whiskey for medicinal purposes. So if you wanted whiskey, you have to go to your doc and get him to write a prescription. You take that prescription to Walgreens, and you can get a pint every 10 days of 100 proof. Well, of course, immediately a lot of people fell ill. And that's what kept bourbon alive during Prohibition. That was 13 years, it was 1920 to 1933. Now, at one point, all this bourbon that was in the rick houses was used up in the medicinal trade. So a distilling holiday was declared for 100 days, and these 6 places fired up the stills and made more bourbon in order to satisfy the medicinal trade. Now, another fun fact here, and Alex is bound to ask you this. Walgreens started in Chicago. He had 5 drugstores. At the end of Prohibition, he had 527. That was because of medicinal whiskey. It wasn't aspirin.
This lady here has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a favorite?
Well, it depends what I want, what I'm doing. I do like Blanton's and Woodford Reserve Double Oak. But that's just me. That doesn't mean it has to be somebody else's favorite. You know, people say, well, do you drink it straight or do you add water? Do you put an ice cube in it? Do you mix it with 7-Up? I do all of that. I mean, nobody but a bourbon snob would say, oh, you should never do it. You can do whatever you bloody well want. It's your mouth. You know? You're the taster. If you like it, and chemically, there is a reason when you put a few drops of water into an ethanol mixture, it does change some of the molecular configuration that opens up the bourbon. And personally, I find a few drops of water from a pipette that I squirt in, that really changes the taste of what I'm drinking. Before I've diluted it, it tastes one way. After I've diluted it, I find I like it better.
There's been some ads recently in magazines about an African-American woman
Oh, yeah.
who claims that her grandfather, or great-grandfather, taught Jack Daniels how to make.
That's right. Yeah.
And now she's making it.
That's right. Her bourbon is, I have it, her bourbon is Uncle Nearest. And it came out after my book was in print, so I couldn't say anything about it or put a picture in it. I subsequently bought it and I like it. It's quite nice. And there are old photographs with Uncle Nearest, the only black guy in this whole group of really pretty rough-looking Tennessee woodsmen near this cabin, and he's in the picture. He's the one who did teach Jack how to make bourbon. He was, for all intents and purposes, the master distiller, and he's now getting his due. And his family member has resurrected his name, and now that is a nice bourbon if you want to try it, or Tennessee whiskey, however you want to call it. Yes, sir.
Does open pollinated corn make better bourbon than the corn we use today?
Well, the corn used in bourbon is field corn,
Yes.
you know, or dent, and you know that's pretty much wind pollinated. It's not the corn you get with corn on the cob. This is the corn you feed the animals. And there are many distillers who claim their corn is absolutely superior to everybody else. People in Texas are making it with white corn or with purple corn. And that has no effect whatsoever on the color because at distillation, there's no color left. It's still out. I can't speak to the fact whether is one kind of corn better than the other. I think the difference would be so trivial that you'd be pretending to say you get a difference.
The open pollinated corn was grown in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was self-pollinated. And it always had better feedback. It made better bourbon.
Yeah, by the time you do these things to it, and by the time you undergo distillation, you're pretty much taking out much of the stuff you don't want to do.
I'd like to reserve the book.
Well, why don't we call it off, and I'll go sit.